June 30, 2024, the day Venezuela's crisis stopped being Venezuela's problem. Let me tell you about the moment I realized this wasn't just another Latin American political meltdown. It was late June, and I was watching, like many of you, the live feed of Venezuelan National Guard troops sealing off the Colombian border near Cucuta. The official reason? Preventing foreign interference. The real reason? That's where the story gets interesting. On the surface, it looked like standard Maduro, another crackdown, another round of sanctions, another desperate attempt to cling to power as the economy implodes. The mainstream narrative was predictable. The New York Times ran a piece about Venezuela's self-inflicted collapse, the Washington Post called it a humanitarian disaster, and the State Department issued a statement condemning the regime's brutal repression. Even the numbers seemed to back it up: GDP down 75% since 2013, 6 million refugees, hyperinflation so severe that people weigh stacks of bolivars instead of counting them. But here's the problem with that: it's incomplete. And in geopolitics, what you don't see is often more dangerous than what you do. I've spent the last 3 decades studying crises like this, not just as academic exercises, but as living, breathing conflicts where the stakes are measured in lives, resources, and the balance of global power. And what I'm about to tell you is that Venezuela's crisis isn't staying local. It can't. Because this isn't just about Maduro's mismanagement or US sanctions. It's about the end of an era, the unraveling of American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, and the scramble by Russia, China, and even Iran to fill the void. This is the first major test of whether the 21st century will be defined by a single superpower or a multipolar world. And the way it plays out will shape everything from the price of gas at your local station to the next global conflict. So let's start by deconstructing the story you've been told. The official regime on the brink. If you've been following the news, here's what Venezuela is: a failed state. Nicolas Maduro, the successor to Hugo Chávez's Bolivarian revolution, has presided over an economic catastrophe. Oil production, the lifeblood of the country, has collapsed from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to barely 700,000 today. The U.S. has imposed crippling sanctions, freezing Venezuelan assets and banning imports of its oil. The opposition, led by Juan Guaidó, briefly rallied international support in 2019, but Maduro outmaneuvered them with a mix of repression and co-optation. Now, the country is a pariah, its people fleeing in droves, its government clinging to power through sheer brutality. That's the story. And on the surface, it checks out. The data is real. The suffering is undeniable. But here's where it gets: the official narrative leaves out 3 critical facts. First, the sanctions didn't just happen. They were designed to collapse the Venezuelan economy. Not to force Maduro out, that's the stated goal, but to ensure that no future government, no matter how democratic, could ever challenge U.S. dominance in the region. This isn't speculation. In 2019, John Bolton, then National Security Advisor, openly admitted that the goal was to make the economy scream to force regime change. And it worked, just not in the way they intended. Second, the US isn't the only player here. Russia and China have poured billions into Venezuela, not out of altruism, but because they see it as a strategic foothold in America's backyard. Russia has sent military advisors, Wagner Group mercenaries, and even nuclear-capable bombers on training exercises in Venezuela. China has restructured Venezuelan debt, built infrastructure, and secured long-term oil contracts. And Iran? It's been quietly supplying refined gasoline in exchange for gold, bypassing U.S. sanctions. Third, and most importantly, the crisis isn't just about Venezuela anymore. It's about the Monroe Doctrine, the 200-year-old U.S. policy that declared Latin America off-limits to foreign powers. For decades, Washington enforced the doctrine with coups, invasions, and economic coercion. But now, for the first time since the Cold War, the U.S. is facing real competition in its own hemisphere. And that changes everything. So let's dig deeper. What's really the hidden war for Venezuela? The data doesn't support the idea that Venezuela's collapse is purely self-inflicted. Yes, Maduro's policies have been disastrous. But the timing of the economic freefall is telling. Venezuela's GDP growth turned negative in 2014, the same year oil prices crashed. But the real collapse began in 2017 after the US imposed its first round of financial sanctions, cutting Venezuela off from global credit markets. By 2019, when the Trump administration recognized Guaido as interim president and imposed a full oil embargo, the economy was already on life support. The sanctions didn't topple Maduro, they ensured that no one else could govern. Here's what's really going: the US is trying to reassert control over a country that dared to defy it. Venezuela under Chavez was the first domino in a wave of leftist governments across Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador that challenged US economic and political dominance. The US response? A campaign of economic warfare, covert operations, and diplomatic isolation. But this time, unlike in the 1970s or 1980s, the US isn't the only game in town. Russia and China see Venezuela as a critical node in their global strategy. For Russia, it's about projecting power into the Western Hemisphere, just as the US does with Ukraine and NATO action in Eastern Europe. For China, it's about securing energy supplies and annexing its Belt and Road Initiative into America's backyard. And for both, it's about proving that the US can no longer dictate terms to the world. This isn't just theory. In 2019, when the US recognized Guaido, Russia sent 2 nuclear-capable Tu-160 bombers to Venezuela in a show of force. When the US imposed oil sanctions, China and India stepped in to buy Venezuelan crude at a discount. And when the US tried to starve Maduro of cash, Iran sent tankers of gasoline in exchange for gold. The message was Venezuela is no longer a US client state. It's a battleground. And that's where the danger lies. Because the more the US pushes, the more Venezuela becomes a proxy war. The broader geopolitical why this matters to you. Let me be: this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of American power. For the last 30 years, since the fall of the Soviet Union, the US has operated as the world's sole superpower. It set the rules, enforced them with military force, and punished those who defied them. But that era is ending. Russia and China are pushing back, not just in their own regions, but globally. And Venezuela is the first major test of whether the US can still enforce its will in its own hemisphere. This is where realist theory comes in. The US has long operated under the assumption of liberal hegemony, the idea that it can and should spread democracy, free markets, and American values through military and economic coercion. But realists like John Mearsheimer argue that this strategy is unsustainable. Great powers don't tolerate rivals in their spheres of influence. And when they try to extend their dominance, they provoke resistance. That's exactly what's happening in Venezuela. The US sees Maduro as a threat to regional stability and a puppet of Russia and China. But Russia and China see US intervention as a direct challenge to their own security. And for countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, the crisis is a test of whether they can chart an independent path or must once again bow to Washington. Historical parallels are instructive here. In 1962, the US and Soviet Union nearly went to war over Cuba. The US saw Soviet missiles in Cuba as an existential threat, the Soviets saw them as a necessary counterbalance to US missiles in Turkey. The crisis was resolved through back-channel diplomacy, but it set the stage for decades of Cold War proxy conflicts. Venezuela today is the 21st century's Cuba. The difference? This time, the US isn't just facing one rival. It's facing 2: Russia and China, with Iran and others waiting in the wings. And the stakes are higher. Because Venezuela isn't just a political crisis. It's an energy crisis. It's a migration crisis. And it's a test of whether the US can still shape the world in its image. Military: the unseen risks. Now, let's talk about the military dimension. Because this is where things get dangerous. The US has a long history of military intervention in Latin America: Guatemala in 1954, Cuba in 1961, Chile in 1973, Grenada in 1983, MA in 1989. And in each case, the interventions were sold as quick, surgical strikes to restore democracy or protect American lives. But in reality, they were messy, protracted, and often counterproductive. Venezuela is no different. The US has already tried covert operations like the 2019 Bay of Piglets fiasco, where a ragtag group of mercenaries tried to invade Venezuela and capture Maduro. It failed spectacularly. But the hawks in Washington haven't given up. In 2020, the Trump administration reportedly considered a naval blockade of Venezuela. In 2023, the Biden administration authorized a $500 million military aid package to Colombia, Venezuela's neighbor and a key U.S. ally. Here's the military intervention in Venezuela would be a disaster. The country has a population of 28 million, a terrain that favors insurgency, and a military that, while poorly equipped, is deeply entrenched in the regime. And unlike Iraq or Afghanistan, Venezuela has powerful allies. Russia has already warned that any U.S. military action would trigger a proportional response. China has economic leverage, Venezuela owes it $60 billion. And Iran? It's already shown it can strike U.S. assets in the region, as it did in 2020 when it fired missiles at a U.S. base in Iraq. The lesson from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya is regime change is easy to start, but impossible to control. And in Venezuela, the risks of escalation are even higher. Because this isn't just about one country. It's about the future of American power. Domestic: why this crisis won't stay in Venezuela. Here's where it gets even more complicated. Because Venezuela's crisis isn't just a foreign policy issue. It's a domestic political issue. And in an election year, that changes everything. Let's start with Florida. The state is home to over 200,000 Venezuelan exiles, many of whom fled Maduro's regime. They're a powerful voting bloc, and both parties are courting them. In 2020, Trump won Florida by just 371,000 votes. The Venezuelan vote could decide the state and the election in 2024. That's why you're seeing a bipartisan push for tougher action on Venezuela. In 2023, the Biden administration reimposed oil sanctions after Maduro reneged on a deal to hold free elections. In 2024, both Trump and Biden have promised to stand with the Venezuelan people. But here's the: neither party has a coherent strategy. They're reacting to domestic politics, not geopolitical reality. And that's dangerous. Because when foreign policy is driven by domestic politics, it leads to bad decisions. The Iraq War was sold as a quick, easy victory to rally the base. The Afghanistan withdrawal was rushed to meet a political deadline. And Venezuela? It's becoming the next political football. The problem is that the U.S. public isn't prepared for the consequences. If the U.S. imposes a naval blockade, gas prices will spike. If Russia or Iran retaliates, it could trigger a wider conflict. And if the U.S. invades, it could lead to a quagmire that makes Iraq look like a cakewalk. But here's the political incentives are all wrong. Because in the short term, tough talk on Venezuela plays well with voters. And that's why this crisis won't stay local. Scenario: how this could play out. So where does this go from here? Let me lay out 3 scenarios, based on decades of studying these kinds of crises. Scenario 1, the best case, a diplomatic off-ramp. In this scenario, the U.S. and Venezuela reach a negotiated settlement. Maduro agrees to hold free elections in exchange for sanctions relief. The opposition participates, and a moderate candidate wins. The U.S. lifts sanctions, Russia and China reduce their involvement, and Venezuela slowly rebuilds. This is the best-case scenario. But it's unlikely. Why? Because Maduro has no incentive to give up power. The opposition is divided. And the U.S. political system rewards toughness, not diplomacy. Scenario 2, the most likely, a frozen conflict. In this scenario, the status quo continues. The U.S. maintains sanctions, but doesn't invade. Russia and China keep propping up Maduro, but don't escalate. Venezuela remains a failed state, its people continue to flee, and the crisis festers. This is the most likely outcome. It's not pretty, but it's stable. The problem? It's not sustainable. Because as long as Venezuela is a battleground, the risk of escalation remains. Scenario 3, the worst case, a proxy war. In this scenario, the U.S. and its allies take direct action, either a naval blockade, a covert operation, or even a limited military strike. Russia and Iran retaliate, either in Venezuela or elsewhere. The conflict spreads, drawing in other Latin American countries. And before you know it, the US is fighting a proxy war in its own hemisphere. This is the nightmare scenario. And while it's unlikely, it's not impossible. Because the more the US pushes, the more Russia and China will push back. The grand strategy why the US keeps failing. Here's the hard: the US is repeating the same mistakes it's made for the last 30 years. It's trying to maintain a global empire that it can no longer afford. And Venezuela is just the latest example. Let's look at the pattern. In the 1990s, the US exited NATO into Eastern Europe, provoking Russia. In the 2000s, it invaded Iraq, destabilizing the Middle East. In the 2010s, it supported regime change in Libya, creating a failed state. And now, in the 2020s, it's trying to overthrow Maduro, risking a wider conflict in Latin America. The problem isn't just that these interventions fail. It's that they make the world more dangerous. Because every time the US tries to impose its will, it provokes resistance. And that resistance is getting stronger. This is the lesson of history. Empires don't collapse because of external threats. They collapse because they overreach. And right now, the US is overreaching in Venezuela. What should we do instead? So what's the alternative? If military intervention is off the table and sanctions aren't working, what should the US do? Here's my controversial: the US should disengage. Not because Maduro is a good leader. Not because Venezuela's crisis isn't real. But because the US can't fix it. And every time it tries, it makes things worse. Instead, the US should focus on 3. 1. Diplomacy, not coercion. The US should work with regional partners like Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia to find a negotiated solution. It should offer sanctions relief in exchange for free elections. And it should accept that Maduro might win, because the alternative is endless conflict. 2. Economic engagement, not isolation. The US should lift sanctions and allow Venezuela to reintegrate into the global economy. This won't fix Venezuela overnight, but it will give its people a chance to rebuild. And it will reduce Russia and China's influence. 3. Great power management. The US should accept that Russia and China are going to have a role in Venezuela. It should work with them to stabilize the country, not push them out. Because the alternative is a proxy war. This isn't a popular position. But it's the only one that makes sense. Because the US can't have it both ways. It can't be the world's policeman and avoid the consequences of empire. And in Venezuela, those consequences are becoming impossible to ignore. The bottom why this matters to you. Let me leave you with: Venezuela's crisis isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of American power. It's about whether the US can still shape the world in its image, or whether it's entering a new era of multipolar competition. And it's about whether the US will learn from its mistakes or repeat them. The mainstream media will keep telling you that this is a simple story of a failed state and a brutal dictator. But the reality is far more complicated. This is a geopolitical chess match, with the US, Russia, China, and Iran all vying for influence. And the stakes couldn't be higher. So pay attention. Because what happens in Venezuela won't stay in Venezuela. It will affect the price of gas. It will affect US elections. And it will shape the world your children inherit. The question: what are we going to do about it? Are we going to keep repeating the same mistakes, or are we going to demand a smarter, more sustainable foreign policy? That's up to us. Because in the end, the most powerful force in geopolitics isn't armies or sanctions. It's an informed citizenry. And right now, we are failing Venezuela and ourselves by not asking the right questions. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's crisis isn't just a political or economic problem. It's a military one. And not in the way you might think. This isn't about Maduro's generals staging a coup or the US sending in the Marines. It's about something far more: the slow-motion militarization of a country that sits at the crossroads of the Western Hemisphere's most critical trade routes, energy flows, and migration corridors. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela isn't just a failed state, it's a strategic failed state. And that makes it a magnet for great powers looking to project influence without direct confrontation. Russia, China, and Iran aren't in Venezuela because they care about socialism or human rights. They're there because Venezuela is a pressure place where they can bleed the US without firing a shot. Take Russia, for example. Since 2019, Moscow has deployed Wagner Group mercenaries, military advisors, and even long-range bombers to Venezuela. In December 2018, 2 Russian Tu-160 nuclear-capable bombers landed in Caracas, a move that sent shockwaves through Washington. The message was Russia can project power into the US's backyard whenever it wants. And it doesn't need a permanent base to do it. Venezuela's crumbling infrastructure and desperate leadership make it the perfect host for a rotating military presence, one that can be scaled up or down depending on the geopolitical temperature. Then there's China. Beijing has poured over $60 billion into Venezuela since 2007, most of it in loans secured by oil. But China isn't just a creditor, it's a security partner. In 2019, China and Venezuela signed a military cooperation agreement that included joint exercises, intelligence sharing, and the sale of Chinese drones and radar systems. The People's Liberation Army isn't deploying troops to Caracas, but it doesn't need to. By embedding itself in Venezuela's security apparatus, China gains a foothold in the Caribbean, just 1,500 miles from Florida. And if the US ever tries to enforce a naval blockade or no-fly zone over Venezuela, it won't just be facing Maduro's decrepit air force. It'll be facing Chinese-made anti-aircraft systems and Russian electronic warfare capabilities. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela is becoming a forward operating base for America's rivals. Not in the traditional sense, but in the 21st century sense, a place where great powers can test the limits of US influence without triggering a direct conflict. And the US is letting it happen. Why? Because Washington is still fighting the last war. It sees Venezuela through the lens of the Cold War, where the goal was to contain communism and prop up friendly dictators. But this isn't the 1980s. The US isn't dealing with a Soviet client state. It's dealing with a country that's being carved up by multiple actors, each with their own agenda. Russia wants to distract the US from Ukraine. China wants to secure access to Venezuela's oil and rare earth minerals. Iran wants to extend its influence in the Western Hemisphere and use Venezuela as a staging ground for proxy operations. And the US? It's stuck in a cycle of sanctions and regime change rhetoric that hasn't worked in 20 years. Meanwhile, the military implications are piling up. Consider Venezuela shares a border with Colombia, a NATO partner and the US's closest ally in South America. If Venezuela collapses into full-blown civil war, or if Maduro's government becomes even more dependent on Russian and Chinese military support, Colombia's security becomes America's problem. The US already has 7 military bases in Colombia, but that's not enough to contain the fallout from a Venezuelan meltdown. We're talking about drug trafficking, arms smuggling, and mass migration, all of which would destabilize the region and force the US to either intervene or accept a permanent security crisis on its doorstep. And let's not forget the energy angle. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, but its production has collapsed from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to just 700,000 today. That's not just a Venezuelan problem, it's a global one. The US has tried to replace Venezuelan oil with Canadian and Saudi imports, but that's a band-aid solution. The real issue is that Venezuela's oil infrastructure is decaying, and the only countries willing to invest in it are Russia and China. If the US doesn't change course, it will wake up one day to find that the world's largest oil reserves are controlled by its adversaries. So what's the military endgame here? It's not a US invasion. That's a non-starter, politically, economically, and strategically. The US learned in Iraq and Afghanistan that regime change is easy, nation building is impossible. The real risk is that Venezuela becomes a permanent gray zone, a place where great powers compete for influence without direct confrontation, but with real consequences for US security. For example, if Russia or China were to establish a permanent military presence in Venezuela, it would force the US to divert resources from other theaters. The U.S. Navy would have to patrol the Caribbean more aggressively, the Air Force would need to monitor Venezuelan airspace, and the CIA would have to track the movements of Russian and Chinese operatives. That's not just a distraction, it's a strategic vulnerability. And it's one that America's rivals are happy to exploit. The other risk is that Venezuela becomes a launchpad for asymmetric warfare. Iran has already used Venezuela to smuggle weapons to Hezbollah and other proxy groups. If the U.S. ever finds itself in a direct conflict with Iran, Venezuela could become a staging ground for attacks on U.S. interests in the region. And if Russia or China were to provide Venezuela with advanced missile systems, it could turn the country into a platform for long-range strikes against the U.S. homeland. That's not science fiction, it's a scenario that the Pentagon has been wargaming for years. So what should the U.S. do? It's not about military intervention. It's about recognizing that Venezuela is a geopolitical battleground, not just a humanitarian disaster. The U.S. needs to stop treating it as a domestic political issue and start treating it as a national security priority. That means 3. First, the U.S. needs to engage with Venezuela's military. Not to stage a coup, but to ensure that it doesn't become a proxy force for Russia or China. The Venezuelan military is corrupt and politicized, but it's also the only institution that can prevent a complete collapse. The U.S. should offer training, intelligence sharing, and economic incentives to keep the military from becoming a tool of great power competition. Second, the U.S. needs to work with Colombia and Brazil to contain the spillover effects of Venezuela's crisis. That means investing in border security, counter-narcotics operations, and regional stability initiatives. The U.S. can't fix Venezuela, but it can prevent its problems from spreading. Third, the U.S. needs to accept that Russia and China are going to have a role in Venezuela. The goal shouldn't be to push them out, it should be to manage their influence. That means engaging with them diplomatically, offering economic incentives for cooperation, and setting clear red lines on military activity. The alternative is a new Cold War in the Western Hemisphere, and that's a war the U.S. can't afford to fight. The bottom line is Venezuela's crisis isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of American power in a multipolar world. And if the U.S. doesn't change its approach, it will wake up one day to find that its backyard is no longer its own. That's not alarmism, it's geopolitical reality. And it's a reality that Washington is woefully unprepared to face. So the next time you hear someone say that Venezuela is just a failed state, ask them what happens when that failed state becomes a forward operating base for America's rivals? What happens when the world's largest oil reserves fall into the hands of countries that don't share America's interests? And what happens when the U.S. is forced to choose between intervention and irrelevance? Those aren't hypothetical questions. They're the questions that will define the next decade of American foreign policy. And right now, we're not even asking them. That's a mistake we can't afford to keep making. Now, what most people don't realize is that the real battle for Venezuela isn't being fought in the streets of Caracas or the oil fields of the Orinoco Belt, it's being fought in the halls of Miraflores Palace, where Nicolas Maduro is playing a game of political survival that would make Machiavelli proud. The man isn't just clinging to power, he's reshaping the state around himself in ways that will make any transition, whether through negotiation, collapse, or coup, far messier than Washington seems to understand. Let me explain why this matters. Maduro's regime has spent the last decade systematically dismantling Venezuela's democratic institutions, but it hasn't replaced them with a coherent authoritarian structure. Instead, what we have is a hybrid system, part military junta, part criminal enterprise, part ideological cult, held together by a mix of repression, patronage, and sheer inertia. The result? A government that can't govern but can't be removed, a state that can't provide basic services but can still project power, and an economy that's both a basket case and a goldmine for those who know how to exploit it. Take the military, for instance. The conventional wisdom in Washington is that the Venezuelan armed forces are a monolith, a Praetorian Guard that keeps Maduro in power out of loyalty or fear. But that's a dangerous oversimplification. The reality is far more fragmented. The high command, generals like Vladimir Padrino Lopez and Ivan Hernandez Dalla, are deeply embedded in the regime's corruption networks, from gold smuggling to drug trafficking. They have no incentive to abandon Maduro because their wealth and power are tied to his survival. But the mid-ranking officers? The colonels and majors who haven't been bought off. They're the ones to watch. Here's the uncomfortable: the Venezuelan military is not a professional institution. It's a patronage network, and like all patronage networks, it's vulnerable to fractures. The problem is that those fractures don't necessarily lead to democracy. They could just as easily lead to warlordism, as we've seen in other collapsed states. Remember Libya after Gaddafi? Somalia after Syed Barre? Venezuela isn't there yet, but the risk is real. And if the military splinters, the country doesn't just get a new government, it gets a free-for-all, with armed factions, criminal gangs, and foreign actors all vying for control. Now, let's talk about the opposition. The Biden administration has been betting on Juan Guaido's interim government as a viable alternative to Maduro, but that bet is looking increasingly shaky. Guaido's legitimacy has been eroded by infighting, corruption scandals, and the simple fact that he controls neither territory nor institutions. The opposition is divided between those who want to negotiate with Maduro, those who want to overthrow him, and those who just want to leave the country. That's not a coalition, it's a dysfunctional family. But here's where it gets interesting. The real opposition to Maduro isn't in the National Assembly or the streets, it's in the barrios and the provinces, where local leaders, community organizations, and even some dissident Chavistas are quietly building alternative power structures. These aren't the kind of people who show up on CNN or get invited to think tank L's in Washington. They're the ones running soup kitchens, organizing protests, and keeping the lights on in neighborhoods where the state has disappeared. They're the ones who could, in theory, form the backbone of a post-Maduro Venezuela. But they're also the ones who are most vulnerable to repression, co-optation, or simply being ignored by the international community. So what does this mean for the future? Let's game out the scenarios. First, there's the status quo. Maduro survives, the economy continues to deteriorate, and Venezuela becomes a zombie state alive enough to avoid total collapse but dead enough to be a permanent crisis. This is the most likely outcome in the short term, and it's the one that Washington seems most comfortable with, because it doesn't require hard choices. But it's also the most dangerous, because it allows the crisis to fester. Every year that Venezuela remains in limbo is another year for Russia and China to deepen their influence, another year for criminal networks to entrench themselves, another year for the humanitarian catastrophe to worsen. And make no, a zombie Venezuela is still a threat. It's a black hole that sucks in migrants, drugs, and instability, and it's a platform for great power competition. Second, there's the negotiated transition. This is what the Biden administration has been pushing for, with the help of Norway and other mediators. The idea is that Maduro and the opposition sit down, agree on a power-sharing arrangement, and hold free elections. It's a nice theory, but it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how power works in Venezuela. Maduro isn't going to negotiate himself out of power. He's not a rational actor in the traditional sense, he's a survivor, and survivors don't give up what they have unless they're forced to. The only way a negotiated transition happens is if Maduro believes that the alternative is worse, either a military coup, a popular uprising, or a complete economic meltdown. Right now, he doesn't. And until he does, any talks are just theater. Third, there's the collapse scenario. This is the one that keeps me up at night. Venezuela's economy is already in freefall, but it could get much worse. Hyperinflation could spiral out of control. The electrical grid could fail completely. The military could fracture, leading to armed conflict. In this scenario, Venezuela doesn't just become a failed state, it becomes a black hole, a place where the rules of the modern world no longer apply. We're talking about a country where the government can't control its own territory, where criminal gangs and armed factions run rampant, and where foreign actors, Russia, China, Iran, even non-state groups like Hezbollah operate with impunity. This isn't just a humanitarian disaster, it's a geopolitical nightmare. Finally, there's the coup scenario. This is the one that Washington seems to be hoping for, even if no one will admit it. The idea is that the military, or a faction within it, decides that Maduro is more trouble than he's worth and removes him. It's happened before in Latin America, just look at Bolivia in 2019 or Ecuador in 2005. But here's a coup in Venezuela wouldn't be like those. It wouldn't be a clean transition to democracy. It would be messy, violent, and unpredictable. The military is too corrupt and too divided to govern effectively. And even if they did, they'd inherit a country that's been hollowed out by years of mismanagement. The best-case scenario is a military junta that holds power for a few years before collapsing into chaos. The worst-case scenario is a civil war. So where does that leave us? The uncomfortable truth is that there are no good options for Venezuela. Every path forward is fraught with risk, and every outcome is likely to be messy. But that doesn't mean we should throw up our hands and walk away. It means we need to be clear-eyed about the stakes and realistic about what's possible. Let me be: the United States cannot fix Venezuela. It can't impose democracy, it can't rebuild the economy, and it can't force Maduro out of power. What it can do is shape the environment in which Venezuela's crisis plays out. That means working with regional partners to contain the spillover effects, engaging with Russia and China to manage their influence, and supporting the local actors who are trying to keep the country from falling apart. It means accepting that Venezuela is going to be a problem for years to come, and that the goal isn't to solve it, it's to prevent it from becoming a catastrophe. But here's the: Washington isn't doing any of that. Instead, it's stuck in a cycle of wishful thinking and half measures. It talks about democracy and human rights, but it doesn't have a strategy for dealing with the reality on the ground. It imposes sanctions, but it doesn't have a plan for what comes in. It engages with the opposition, but it doesn't have a way to turn their moral authority into actual power. And that's the real danger. Because while the US is dithering, Venezuela's crisis is metastasizing. It's spreading to Colombia, where the ELN and dissident FARC groups are using Venezuelan territory as a safe haven. It's spreading to Brazil, where the Amazon is becoming a transit route for drugs and illegal gold. It's spreading to the Caribbean, where Russian and Iranian influence is growing. And it's spreading to the United States, where the political fallout from the migration crisis is fueling polarization and extremism. This isn't just a Venezuelan problem. It's an American problem. And if we don't start treating it that way, we're going to wake up one day and realize that the crisis we ignored has become the crisis we can't escape. That's not alarmism, it's just the way geopolitics works. And right now, we're not even in the game.